At 3:47 in the morning, the sky above Doha split apart with the roar of Israeli F-35 jets. Precision missiles struck a communications hub, turning a sleeping city into a theater of chaos. Glass shattered, smoke rose, and families huddled in fear. What looked like a single strike in the Gulf was, in truth, a message to the world. Sovereignty could be violated in the dark of night. For those in Africa tuning into radios thousands of miles away, the sound was all too familiar. They remembered the bombs that once fell on their own soil, the justifications offered in the name of counterterrorism, in the silence that followed. But this time silence was broken. A young captain in Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré, picked up the phone and told Benjamin Netanyahu, "Africa will not stay silent." This was not a loud threat. It was a calm declaration, heavy with history, and it marked a turning point. Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It is a hinge in history. Subscribe and witness the story of how Africa, long treated as a stage, stepped forward as the actor. The night sky over Doha was supposed to be silent. Instead, it became the stage for a sudden eruption of fire and steel. At 3:47 in the morning, Israeli jets released precision missiles that tore into a communications hub, jolting the capital awake. Windows rattled, children screamed, and the peace of night gave way to smoke and confusion. Israel described it as counterterrorism, a preemptive strike. But to the people who witnessed it, it was the violation of sovereignty, a reminder that even in the 21st century, the strong still claimed the right to strike at will. In Africa, the news traveled quickly across radio waves. In Ouagadougou, in Lagos, in Bamako, people listened in stunned silence. For many, it was not just Qatar that was under attack. It was a mirror of their own histories, of invasions defended as humanitarian missions, of bombings justified as aid, of dignity reduced to footnotes in someone else's script. For men like Adama, a 67-year-old miner in Burkina Faso, the broadcast brought a cold shiver of recognition. "They test Qatar today," he whispered to his wife. "Tomorrow they test us." It was in this atmosphere of uncertainty that Ibrahim Traoré, the young captain leading Burkina Faso, acted with speed. Reports say that within hours of the strike, he made a direct call to Benjamin Netanyahu. Calm but unyielding, he told the Israeli prime minister, "Your aircraft crossed a line. Africa will not stay silent." The words carried weight not because of military might, but because they drew upon a history of silenced voices now refusing to be ignored. From that moment, events accelerated. African capitals convened emergency meetings. Leaders who had often hesitated to take bold positions suddenly found themselves inspired by Traoré's clarity. Within 6 hours, joint statements were being drafted. Within 12 hours, Netanyahu's office was desperately attempting to reach the African Union, realizing that the continent's unity could unravel decades of Israeli diplomacy. The strike on Qatar might have been intended as a show of strength in the Middle East, but in reality, it triggered something larger, an awakening across Africa. For decades, the continent had been spoken for, positioned as a follower in international affairs. Now, it was speaking for itself, transforming an attack in the Gulf into a reckoning that stretched across continents. The story was no longer about jets in the sky. It was about the echo of sovereignty, the refusal of a people to let their dignity be trampled once again. And as the smoke rose over Doha, a different kind of fire began to burn across Africa. A fire of defiance, of unity, of long-suppressed pride finding its voice. But this was only the beginning, because what came after Traoré's phone call would shake Tel Aviv more than the strike itself. The cameras flickered on in Ouagadougou. Ibrahim Traoré stood not in a polished suit but in his military fatigues, eyes steady, voice unwavering. In front of the world, he declared, "No nation targets another nation's capital and expects African silence." It was a sentence that cut through the noise of diplomacy and struck deep into the hearts of millions. The words traveled quickly. Radios in marketplaces buzzed with his speech. Television anchors repeated the line with urgency. WhatsApp groups lit up with images of Doha burning and Traoré's face beside them. For many Africans, the moment was electric. It was no longer about Qatar. It was about every village that had been bombed, every city invaded, every promise of aid that masked the theft of resources. From Accra to Abuja, from Bamako to Johannesburg, governments moved swiftly. Ghana's parliament erupted in heated debate, with members demanding the suspension of Israeli contracts. Nigeria's president went further, refusing Netanyahu's call outright, signaling that this was no longer just Burkina Faso's defiance, but Africa's. In Mali, slogans appeared overnight on walls, Africa bows to no one. In South Africa, elderly citizens phoned into late-night radio shows, remembering apartheid and warning against silence. The reaction was not just political, it was personal. Families remembered the names of those who had dared to speak before, Lumumba, Sankara, Gaddafi, and feared that Traore might share their fate. An old miner named Adama told his grandson, "Be proud your president spoke, but be ready. They killed the others. They may try to kill him too." His words carried both pride and dread, capturing the pulse of a continent both hopeful and wary. Tel Aviv, meanwhile, reeled. Defense planners had dismissed Burkina Faso as a small landlocked state with little leverage. Yet within 24 hours, contracts worth billions were under threat. Military cooperation agreements were being canceled. Intelligence sharing programs were frozen. The Israeli ambassador in Ouagadougou requested an urgent audience, calling the whole matter a misunderstanding. Traore's reply was sharp and unambiguous. "The only misunderstanding is believing Africa will remain silent when sovereignty is trampled." This was a new script. Traditionally, Israel or its allies would apologize, Washington would apply pressure, and African governments would back down quietly. But now the old lines had been torn apart. Africa was no longer whispering from the sidelines. It was roaring from the center of the stage. Netanyahu had expected solidarity from Washington and indifference from Africa. Instead, he faced a continent united by dignity, unwilling to let history repeat itself. Defense firms in Tel Aviv began recalculating losses, fearing the collapse of long-standing partnerships. Israeli analysts appeared on television, shaken by the speed and force of the backlash. "We underestimated them," one admitted. What stunned the world was not only the speed of Africa's response, but the symbolism. For once, Africa was not reacting as a bystander. It was shaping the narrative. It was telling the world that sovereignty was not negotiable, that dignity was not disposable. And yet, as the rhetoric rose and solidarity spread, a question lingered beneath the surface. Could this defiance hold when confronted with the immense weight of American and European pressure? The roar had begun, but would it echo or would it fade? When the dust settled in Doha, the aftershocks were felt not only in Qatar, but across the African continent. In Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso announced a suspension of all military cooperation with Israel. Training programs were halted. Intelligence sharing channels were cut. Contracts once considered untouchable were ripped apart in a matter of hours. What Israel had dismissed as symbolic rhetoric was now materializing into costly consequences. The decision resonated far beyond the corridors of power. Ordinary citizens in Burkina Faso felt a renewed sense of pride, but also unease. On the streets, young men painted slogans on walls, "Africa bows to no one." At the same time, mothers whispered in markets about the risks of standing up to a nuclear-armed state backed by Washington. Pride and fear mingled like two sides of the same coin. The cancellation of Israeli contracts rippled through the region. In Ghana, lawmakers debated suspending agricultural and defense projects. In Nigeria, the refusal to answer Netanyahu's call sent a signal of continental solidarity. The African Union began circulating draft resolutions condemning Israel's strike, with language sharper than any statement in recent memory. Yet the political courage carried a heavy weight. Burkina Faso, already struggling with economic instability, faced the reality that aid, investment, and trade could be weaponized against it. Would Western powers retaliate by freezing funding? Would Israeli firms leverage allies in Washington to isolate the country further? Traore's gamble was not only diplomatic, it was existential. For ordinary Burkinabe citizens, the effects were both immediate and symbolic. In Ouagadougou, crowds gathered outside the presidential palace, chanting prayers and holding candles. They were not only defending a president, they were defending an idea that sovereignty mattered more than aid, that dignity outweighed dependency. Families invoked the names of fallen African leaders, reminding each other that history often punished those who dared to lead. International media began to split in its portrayal. Western analysts dismissed Traore as reckless, warning that Burkina Faso might pay a steep price for its defiance. African commentators, however, compared his words to those of Thomas Sankara, calling the stance a renewal of dignity in global politics. The divide reflected more than geopolitics. It reflected two different worldviews, one that saw small states as expendable, and another that saw them as the moral compass of a new century. It was at this point that the narrative of the Ibrahim Traoré coup gained traction internationally. Commentators debated whether his rise to power had been an accident of history or the spark of a larger African revolution. Critics framed his leadership as fragile, temporary, destined to collapse under pressure. Supporters countered that it was precisely his unyielding defiance that had awakened a continent. What no one could deny was that the symbolic weight of Burkina Faso's stance had shaken Israel and its allies. The smallest of nations had revealed the limits of raw military power. The poorest of economies had demonstrated the leverage of moral authority. The humblest of voices had forced the world to listen. Still, beneath the celebrations lay an unanswered question. Could this fragile unity hold when Washington began to exert pressure? When Europe dangled aid as bait? When old divisions resurfaced? History taught Africans to be cautious, to remember that betrayals often came not only from outside, but also from within. The events unfolding were no longer about contracts or airstrikes. They were about sovereignty itself, about whether Africa would allow itself to be defined as the silent background of others, or whether it would seize the pen to write its own future. And just as the continent was finding its voice, the world turned its gaze to Addis Ababa, where the African Union was preparing an unprecedented response. In Addis Ababa, the marble halls of the African Union filled with hurried footsteps. Delegates from across the continent gathered for an emergency summit. Normally, such meetings stretched on for weeks, diluted by bureaucracy. This time, within hours, a unanimous resolution was passed. Israel's strike on Qatar was condemned in the strongest possible terms. Diplomatic privileges were suspended. Defense contracts were frozen. For the first time in decades, Africa spoke with one voice, not as a follower, but as a leader. The symbolism did not go unnoticed. In Cairo, the Arab League extended an invitation for Ibrahim Traoré to address its emergency session. It was unprecedented. A young soldier from a small landlocked nation stood before kings and presidents, declaring, "Qatar stood with Africa when others looked away. Today, Africa stands with Qatar." His words, broadcast from Cairo to Casablanca, reverberated across the Middle East. Washington and Brussels watched with unease. American officials called for restraint, insisting that Burkina Faso's stance was destabilizing. European leaders urged balance, but their words carried little weight. Africans remembered Iraq. They remembered Libya. They remembered how balance had so often meant submission. The difference now was not vocabulary, it was courage. The momentum was not just regional. Latin American leaders praised Africa's defiance, seeing echoes of their own struggles against Western dominance. In Asia, commentators pointed to Africa's unity as a model of sovereignty defended without apology. Across the global south, Traoré's name was invoked alongside leaders who once defied empires. The narrative shifted quickly in the media. What began as Israel's attack on Qatar was now framed as the Burkina Faso Revolution, a defiant stand that turned a small nation into the symbol of a continent's awakening. Israel, expecting to isolate Qatar, found itself isolated instead. Yet even as applause echoed in Addis Ababa and Cairo, another question lingered. Would this bold unity survive once Washington truly entered the stage? The halls of power in Tel Aviv and Washington buzzed with urgency. But in the streets of Ouagadougou, the conversation was about something deeper, the future. For the first time in decades, Africans dared to imagine a path where their voices shaped not just their own destiny, but the balance of global politics. Burkina Faso's defiance had exposed two possibilities. On one hand, there was risk, the risk of economic sanctions, of diplomatic isolation, of pressure so immense it could break even the strongest will. On the other hand, there was opportunity, the chance to define Africa not as a silent backdrop to the ambitions of others, but as a continent charting its own course. For Ibrahim Traoré, the challenge was clear. How could a small, landlocked nation maintain momentum against superpowers armed with both bombs and banknotes? The answer, he argued, lay not in weapons or aid, but in dignity, in the moral authority of sovereignty. Words without action are powerless, he told his cabinet. If sovereignty is not defended today, it will be erased tomorrow. Across Africa, the mood was one of cautious pride. In Bamako, young men painted slogans declaring that Africa had spoken. In Nairobi, women's groups marched with banners proclaiming, "Sovereignty is sacred." In Lagos, taxi drivers tuned their radios to call-in shows, demanding that their leaders follow Burkina Faso's example. The message was clear. For once, Africa was not waiting for permission. It was writing its own rules. Yet the road ahead was uncertain. History warned that unity could fracture under external pressure. Would African leaders resist when Washington dangled contracts or when Brussels threatened sanctions? Would the continent hold firm when tested, or would old divisions resurface? These questions hung heavy, unanswered, as the world watched. But there was also hope. Hope that Africa's roar would not fade into whispers. Hope that the sacrifices of past generations, Lumumba, Sankara, Gaddafi, would not be in vain. Hope that a new generation, led by voices like Traore's, would carry the flame of dignity forward. As the dust of the crisis settled, one truth became clear. Africa was no longer content to be the subject of someone else's story. It was determined to write its own. And so the world was left with a question that no analyst, no diplomat, no general could easily answer. Was this the beginning of a fleeting moment, or the dawn of a new era where Africa stood not as an audience, but as the actor on the global stage? In the span of 1 week, the script of global politics was rewritten. A continent often portrayed as passive, poor, and peripheral had risen with a voice so strong it could not be ignored. From Ouagadougou to Cairo, from Johannesburg to Lagos, Africa declared that sovereignty was not negotiable. Not for Israel, not for Washington, not for anyone. Ibrahim Traoré did not invent this yearning for dignity. He simply gave it a voice, one that carried the echoes of Lumumba's courage, Sankara's vision, and Gaddafi's defiance. His stand reminded Africans and the world that every generation produces those willing to pay the price for freedom. International analysts framed it as reckless, a gamble by a small state that could not possibly last. Yet the reality was more profound. What the world witnessed was not just a reaction to Israel's strike on Qatar. It was the revelation that moral authority could outweigh missiles, that the unity of the weak could shake the confidence of the strong. For the people of Burkina Faso, it was more than politics. It was survival. It was dignity. It was the belief that their voices mattered in a world that had long dismissed them. And for millions across the globe, it was inspiration. Proof that even in an age of drones and superpowers, courage could still redraw the map. This moment will be remembered not only as a headline, but as a hinge in history. The Ibrahim Traoré coup was not simply about seizing power in a small African state. It became a symbol of defiance against silence, a reminder that sovereignty defended with conviction can awaken an entire continent. The Burkina Faso revolution was not fought with guns and tanks, but with words, unity, and moral clarity. If this story moves you, let it not end here. Subscribe, share, and add your voice to the chorus. Because the struggle for dignity is not just Africa's story, it belongs to all of us.